Hi class, welcome to Module 7. Hope everyone's doing well. In this module, you'll be learning about the scope of methods and how it controls the application and functionality of your program in classes. You'll also be learning about the role of documentation in object-oriented programming and specifically focusing on documentation methods using JavaDoc. Okay, so you'll be reading about this in your Zybooks reading. You'll be required to do the practice activities. And I highly recommend that you work through the challenge activities as well. JavaDoc is especially important, and you're going to have to actually submit JavaDoc for your final project. And JavaDoc is essentially documentation. So you're explaining your code at a high level, closer to plain English. I'm explaining what the classes do, what the methods do, the variables, etc., to the user at a high level, right? So they're able to understand your program, your application, without having to read through the actual syntax and code. So finally, you'll be working on Milestone 2. So Milestone 2 will be focused on completing the finalized version of the recipe and recipe test class. Okay, so this is going to be very similar to Stepping Stone Lab 5. However, this is going to be a more finalized version. So let's actually go through Milestone 2. So here we are at Milestone 2, the Milestone 2 Guidelines and Rubric document. So this Milestone 2 is going to be very similar to the Stepping Stone Lab 5 assignment in that you'll need to create your recipe class as well as the recipe test class that tests the functionality of the recipe class. Okay, so the difference is that this is going to be a more complete finalized version of the recipe class. Okay, so you want to make sure you include all of the points addressed here. So you want to first make sure that you include all of the class instance variables, the recipe name, servings, recipe ingredients, and total recipe calories. So although it's not required, I do recommend that you make this recipe ingredients array list an array list of ingredient objects. Okay, so it's only required that it be an array list of strings which holds the ingredient name, but it will be better because better preparation for the final project if you make this recipe ingredients variable an array list of ingredient objects which stores the complete ingredient object. So the ingredient object holds the name, the amount, calories, etc. So it will hold more properties of the ingredient, right, opposed to just a string which can only hold the ingredient name. Additionally, you'll have to have access and mutator methods for each of these instance variables. You have to have constructors, so I recommend that you have a constructor that contains no parameters and sets default values to each of these variables, and another one that takes in parameters. Additionally, you'll need a print recipe method and a create new recipe method. And you should have done both of these in Stepping Stone Lab 5, however, you just want to make them, again, make sure that they are complete. Remember that the create new recipe method is important because you want to make sure that if you are using an array list of ingredients for the recipe ingredients variable, if you're using the ingredient object, you want to make sure that you either ask the user for each of the ingredient properties inside of this method when you're asking them to add a new ingredient. You can either do this directly within this create new recipe method, or you can create a method in the ingredient class that prompts the user to enter all of the ingredient attributes and then returns an ingredient object. Okay, so these are just different ways you can do this. The idea here is that you want to have the create new recipe method return a recipe object that contains all of the new recipe attributes, as well as for the recipe ingredients list contains all of the ingredients and their attributes as well. However, it's okay if you just want to include a recipe ingredients array list that just holds the ingredients, the names of the ingredients. Okay, so there's just two ways you can do it. Again, I highly recommend that you allow your recipe ingredients array list to hold the ingredient object. Okay, and finally, you're going to be required to have pseudocode, write pseudocode for the custom method selected from the list in Stepping Stone Lab 5. So let's quickly look at this list in Stepping Stone Lab 5. So here we are on page 2 of the Stepping Stone Lab 5 guidelines document. So this is the list that the Milestone 2 is referring to. So here are on number 4 are the different custom methods that you can choose from, right? So they're essentially modifications or just customization that you can add to the recipe class. So you can print out a recipe with amounts adjusted for different number of servings. You can calculate recipe cost. You can calculate select nutritional information. So these are additional methods that you should be able to add to the recipe class, right? So the goal is for Milestone 2 is to select one of these and write pseudocode. So don't write the actual code, but write pseudocode for the method that you select. And this pseudocode you can put within comments of the recipe class that you'll be submitting, right? So you don't need to submit an additional document, text document, or Word document. Don't do that. Just write the pseudocode within comments of inside the recipe class. Okay, so back to the Milestone 2 guidelines. So additionally, you'll have to create this recipe test.java file. So this should contain a main method that uses the constructor to create a new recipe. So you can test out both types of constructors, the one with parameters, the one without. You want to make sure the print recipe method works, and you want to invoke the create new recipe method to access user input. So you want to essentially test out the different methods, the accessor, mutator, constructors, the print recipe, and create new recipe methods that you will be creating in your recipe class. So again, this is very similar to Stepping Stone Lab 5. You probably have created this already. Again, but this is kind of just gonna be a more complete finalized version. So it should be separate, right? So you want to make sure that you're submitting your recipe class and this recipe_test class that test the recipe class by invoking these different methods and testing out the different constructors, accessor, mutator methods, etc. Okay, so how you do that is there's no specific method of how you do that, but you just want to make sure that you're calling each of the methods in the recipe class and testing them out and ensuring that they work. Okay, so this is what will happen in the recipe_test.java. So it should contain only a main method for testing the recipe class. Okay, and then I highly recommend that you read through these critical elements and make sure you address each, as this is what's going to be used for grading your assignment. Okay, and definitely look through this rubric that you see here and look through the proficient column and make sure you're addressing all the points in the proficient column. Right, so this is going to be used to actually grade your assignment. So you want to make sure that you read this thoroughly and make sure you're addressing each of these critical elements. Okay, so that is it. If you guys have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to me directly or on the discussion board. Thanks.